So it is my great pleasure to introduce someone here who probably needs no introduction in this room. This is Dr. Christopher Epplett, a professor of ancient history in the Department of History, who regularly teaches one of the most popular classes in University History 2001. So popular, in fact, that we split up our major to allow our archaeology students to be able to actually get enrolled in that class because it's so difficult for our students to get into it for him. So Chris is one of the world experts on Roman animal combat. And so if you ever want to know about beasts fighting in the Colosseum, he is the person in the world to come ask about this. He also has fantastic knowledge of really, really bad films. And he often peppers his classroom lectures with radically inappropriate and unfunny jokes. So with that introduction, I will leave it to Dr. Epplett to speak to us about Persian gardens.
Thank you, Kevin, I think. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me. Because of the technical difficulties, we're a little bit behind schedule, so I will probably carry on without further ado. I could talk even faster than I normally do, but since people often accuse me of talking too fast at regular speed, that would be a bad idea. Before I begin my talk, just a few words by way of introduction. First of all, although much of my conversation concerns the ancient Near East, I make no claims to be a Near Eastern historian. Therefore, I apologize in advance for any hideous mispronunciations of Near Eastern names or terms I might make in the following talk, or if I put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. I would also happily be corrected if I blatantly misrepresented any pieces of Near Eastern evidence in my discussion. Now that I've apologized in advance for my talk, let us begin. I should first of all explain why Greek and Roman historians such as myself might dabble outside my area of specialization in the first place. The initial inspiration for the talk I'm going to present today is my research on the Venationes, the popular stage beast hunts of the Roman arena. In the course of my work, I've encountered a number of sources claiming, in a somewhat offhand fashion, that such events can ultimately trace their origins back to the exotic game parks and gardens of the ancient Near East, commonly denoted by the Greek term paradisoi. I've therefore been researching the paradisoi in some detail in order to ascertain their possible legacy in later cultures, in particular that of Rome. One legacy of the paradisoi should be particularly evident. As will be discussed later in the talk, the concept of paradise found in a number of religions, including Christianity, ultimately derives its name from that of the ancient Near Eastern paradisoi. The term paradisoi, as we shall later see in more detail, was initially used by the Greeks to denote the large game parks and gardens which they encountered in the Persian Empire during the classical and Hellenistic period. This term, in turn, was transliterated from the Old Persian word paraditsa, meaning in its simplest sense, a fenced or walled orchard. Although the Persians thus are responsible for the term paradisoi and its derivatives in other languages, including, of course, paradise in English, it is nonetheless important to note that the collecting of both animals and plants in parks and enclosures had a long history in the Near East, even prior to the rise of the Persian Empire. Since this region witnessed perhaps the earliest development of large-scale irrigation and plant domestication in the world, it is not surprising that planned gardens, in particular, have a long history in the Near East as well. In ancient Egypt, certainly, the collection of exotic animals was a royal prerogative from an early date. The relevant archaeological and literary evidence suggests, for example, that the Egyptians attempted to tame such animals as cheetahs, baboons, and falcons as early as the mid-3rd millennium BCE. Many such animals were considered sacred and employed by the Egyptians in various religious rituals. In the same period, the pharaoh Sahore is recorded as importing bears from Syria, presumably to be kept in some sort of royal enclosure. A millennium later, Queen Hatshepsut sent an expedition to the land of Punt, possibly located in what is now Eritrea. Canadian and American historians are divided as to whether this expedition to Punt was sent on 3rd or 4th down. I debated whether I should make such a terrible joke, but ultimately I decided to do so, and I think it was the right decision. So Kevin warned you when he introduced me, but I don't think there's anything so awful as that later in my paper, though. So. Yeah, well, yeah, the verdict's still up. So yes, Queen Hatshepsut sent an expedition to the land of Punt to obtain various luxury goods. Amongst the items obtained by her representatives were baboons, monkeys, and a giraffe, all of whom were presumably maintained in some sort of royal menagerie back in Egypt. Egyptian sources also periodically make mention of such animals as antelopes being demanded as tribute from vassal states as well. The practice of procuring animals through tribute, as we shall see, was certainly not restricted to the Egyptians in antiquity. The ancient Egyptians also had a long established tradition of planned gardens and the importation of exotic plants. Evidence for planned gardens goes back as far as the 3rd and 4th dynasties of the Old Kingdom in the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. It should also be noted that one of the luxury goods brought back from Punt in the previously mentioned Egyptian expedition was myrrh trees. Although, as one might expect, archaeological evidence of planned gardens in terms of architectural remains is not abundant, enough evidence does remain to indicate that this tradition continued at a much later date in Pharaonic Egypt. The later palaces at Thebes and Amarna, for example, are known to have had both parks and gardens. In addition, the Palace of Apries, built in the 6th century BCE, included natural amenities as well. This particular complex may well have influenced the design of later parks and gardens in Ptolemaic Egypt. One potentially interesting point to note in connection with this brief discussion of early Egyptian gardens and animal enclosures is a period in which these facilities appear to have emerged in the mid-3rd millennium. Of course, there may be even earlier evidence yet to be discovered, or which I, as a dabbler in Near Eastern history, have not yet discovered. But if this date is at all accurate, it suggests that royal menageries and gardens were being established at roughly the same time as Old Kingdom Egypt was establishing itself as a major power in the ancient Near East. As we shall see in the case of other ancient cultures, the collection of exotic flora and fauna certainly could be one way in which powerful rulers like the pharaohs of Egypt advertised both their wealth and the extent of their domains. Gardens and game parks are also attested elsewhere in the ancient Near East outside of Egypt from an early date. Palace gardens are attested as early as the late 2nd millennium BCE, although, as we shall see, they first reached their full flowering, so to speak, in the Neo-Assyrian period of the 1st millennium BCE. So-called sacral gardens or sacred gardens are known in Mesopotamia from the beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE. Within gardens of this type, rituals were performed in honor of the god to whom a particular god was dedicated. And the king, in such a context, served a symbolic role as the gardener of his god's domain. The importance of this symbolic role, perhaps, can be seen in certain semi-legendary traditions which later circulated throughout the Near East concerning Sargon of Akkad, who established one of the earliest Mesopotamian empires in the late 3rd millennium BCE. One such tradition, which originated in the early 2nd millennium BCE, relates that Sargon's father was a gardener prior to that Sargon's father was a gardener, more specifically a date grower. Another tradition, recorded in Assyrian sources of approximately a millennium later, draws an even more blatant connection between Sargon's sacral roles as gardener and king. According to this account, Sargon himself was a gardener prior to becoming king, during which time he was loved by no less than the goddess Ishtar herself. Evidently, this was one of the benefits of horticulture in the ancient Near East. The Near Eastern motif of king as gardener had a long existence and even found its way into Greek historiography. In the Hellenistic period, for example, a number of Greek writers claimed that a certain Abdolonymus, installed as king of Sidon by Alexander the Great, had been a humble gardener before attaining his royal post, a story which certainly appears to belong to the same milieu as much earlier accounts concerning Sargon of Akkad. Game preserves, or more generally the collection of animals, also originated at an early date in Mesopotamia and the surrounding regions. The keeping of lions in cages, for example, is attested in the city-state of Ur as early as 2000 BCE. An important subsequent figure in the collection not only of exotic animals, but of plants as well, is the Middle Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser I, who ruled from 1114 to 1076 BCE. His royal inscriptions record not only the king's alleged hunting prowess in the course of his extensive campaigns, but his more peaceful collecting exploits as well. And I quote from one of these inscriptions. By the command of the god Ninurta, who loves me, I slew 4 extraordinarily strong wild virile bulls in the desert. I killed 10 strong bull elephants in the land Huron, and 4 live elephants I captured. I brought the hides and tusks with the live elephants to my city Ashur. I killed on foot 120 lions with my wildly vigorous assault. In addition, 800 lions I felled from my light chariot. I have brought down every kind of wild beast and winged birds of the heavens whenever I have shot an arrow. I got control of and formed herds of deer, gazelles, ibex, which the gods Ashur and Ninurta, the gods who love me, had given me in the course of the hunt. I took cedar, box tree, a Canish or Canish oak from the lands over which I had gained dominion, such trees which none among previous kings had ever planted, and I planted them in the orchards of my land. I took rare orchard fruit, which is not found in my land, and filled the orchards of Assyria. Needless to say, as a bit of an editorial comment, there may be a slight exaggeration in some of the figures quoted there, but the basic idea appears to be accurate. But inscriptions such as these attested to the king's power and solicitude for his subjects in various ways, through the slaughter of both human and animal threats to his realm, and through the introduction of new plant and animal species into Assyria. As we shall see, the activities of Tiglath-Pileser I, as well as the associated propaganda, form a model for his more famous successors. Ashur-bel-kala, for example, who ruled Assyria in the early 11th century BCE, boasted of capturing and breeding various animals and displaying them to his subjects. It is during the reign of the same monarch that we have the sole reference in extant Assyrian sources to merchants being sent to purchase animals, such as bisons and dromedaries, for the king. Assyrian monarchs perhaps relied predominantly upon successful warfare or tribute from other states, in particular Egypt, to replenish their animal supplies. Further afield, both planned gardens and animal enclosures are also known from the late 2nd and early 1st millennium BCE in the Levant and Eastern Mediterranean. The Minoan culture of Crete, for example, which reached its zenith in the mid-2nd millennium BCE, is thought to have possessed palace gardens, perhaps used in a sacral context. Homer's description of King Alcinous's magnificent palace gardens on the island of Phaeacia, containing such delectable fruits as apples, pomegranates, figs, and grapes, is thought by some scholars to recall the earlier garden complexes of the Minoans. Certainly, no such elaborate gardens appear to have existed in Greece at the time the Odyssey was written down, sometime in the 8th century BCE. Solomon, king of Israel in the 10th century BCE, is credited by the Bible with possessing a considerable collection of exotic animals, including apes and peacocks, which presumably were maintained in some sort of royal enclosure. Therefore, by the beginning of the 1st millennium BCE, the tradition of royal gardens and animal parks appears to have been firmly established throughout the Near East and beyond, a tradition which was greatly elaborated upon by subsequent Assyrian and Persian rulers. The Assyrian Empire reached its height of power and territorial extent in the first half of the 1st millennium BCE, the so-called Neo-Assyrian Empire. And it is certainly no coincidence that the rulers of this period, partly as a result of and partly in advertisement of this expansion, collected both animals and plants on a heretofore unprecedented scale. They also, of course, expanded the facilities necessary for such flora and fauna. This proliferation of plant and animal enclosures is reflected, I should say, in Assyrian terminology. For the first time, the term Ambasu appears in Assyrian inscriptions, a term which appears to denote a treed park with wild animals. The word Bitanu, which also appears in the same period, refers to the pavilions which Assyrian kings would often build as part of such parks and gardens. In the 9th century BCE, Ashur-nasir-pal II not only boasted in his inscriptions of establishing new royal gardens in Assyria and planting some 40 varieties of trees, including date palms, plum, and pear trees within them. In addition, the same ruler is credited with collecting, breeding, and displaying various exotic animals such as elephants and gazelles, although at least some of these animals were killed in hunts staged in royal enclosures. Like other Assyrian rulers, Ashur-nasir-pal proclaimed both his prowess and solicitude for his subjects by killing dangerous animals like lions. And just a side note here, these royal hunts were, of course, carefully staged to prevent any real danger to the monarch in question, who, of course, was supposed to be slaying the animals through his own prowess. I think the bodyguards have sort of dropped the ball in this scene, because I don't think the lion is supposed to be climbing onto the axle of the chariot. You know, Ashurnasirpal is depicted quite heroically shooting the animal down, but I imagine in real life he had been quaking in his boots a bit. Some bodyguards may have been fired after this episode, or perhaps even worse, but anyhow. It is under King Sargon II and his successors in the late 8th and 7th centuries BCE that the proliferation of royal gardens and enclosures, as well as the collection of requisite animals and plants, reaches its maximum extent in Assyria. The new royal palace built at Khorsabad by Sargon II between 713 and 706 BCE included a lavish garden adjacent to the palace, which was said to contain all of the plants and trees native to Hittite territory in what is now Turkey. Sargon II is also said to have imported plants native to Syria during his reign. In both of these instances, the plants involved are carefully chosen to represent territories in which Sargon had successfully campaigned during his reign. In addition to building gardens, however, Sargon also realized the propaganda value of destroying gardens possessed by rival states. In the course of his campaign against Ur-Artu in 714 BCE, the Assyrian king destroyed the lush gardens and orchards encountered by his troops as a clear indication that Ur-Artu was now subject to Assyrian authority. And I quote from the relevant royal proclamation. This is Sargon talking, allegedly. Into his pleasant gardens, which adorned his city and which were overflowing with fruit and wine, my fierce warriors rushed, and they made the noise of iron axes to resound, and great quantities of his fruit came tumbling down. His great trees, the adornment of his palace, I cut down like millet, and his province I brought to shame. Sargon's son, Sennacherib, was perhaps even more active during his reign in the construction of horticultural and zoological enclosures. Outside of the Assyrian capital, Nineveh, the king built a terrace garden complete with stone aqueducts, which in terms of the trees and plants it contained, was designed to mimic the flora of the Amanus range in what is now southeastern Turkey. Similarly, Sennacherib created an artificial marsh in the vicinity of Nineveh, in which he placed such animals as herons and wild swine. Through such efforts, the king created a microcosm of the Assyrian Empire as a whole for his subjects in the heartland. Much of our best pictorial evidence for Assyrian parks and gardens comes from the reign of Assyria's last powerful king, Ashurbanipal, who ruled from 668 to approximately 630 BCE. Like his forebears, Ashurbanipal was active in expanding the Assyrian collection of exotica. For example, amongst the booty brought back by his army from the Egyptian city of Thebes after its sack were a number of monkeys. Many of the surviving reliefs from Ashurbanipal's palace depict him slaying lions and other animals as a mark of his royal authority, although other scenes hint at the fact that Assyrian enclosures were not merely used for animal slaughter. So yes, here's one of the more pleasant Assyrian reliefs. There's not a dying or dead animal in sight. Yes, which is just a depiction of Ashurbanipal and his queen enjoying some leisure time out in the garden. Unfortunately, Assyrian reliefs more typically depict scenes like this, in which once again the king heroically is dispatching various animals with, of course, his attendants and bodyguards standing by to make sure that he doesn't actually get mauled to death during this important ceremony. Yeah, I won't dwell on this image. I mean, these Assyrian reliefs are very skillfully executed, but the level of skill in these reliefs sometimes makes them much more disturbing when they're depicting things like this poor dying lioness. So I will switch to a much more pleasant scene here. Apart from their use as venues for various rituals, as well as leisure facilities, it is important to note that Assyrian parks and gardens often had a more practical purpose as well. The plant and animal resources produced in these enclosures were an important source of revenue for the Assyrian state. As we shall see, such a variety of functions is also characteristic of later Persian paradisoi. One of the prominent states, which was responsible for Assyria's downfall in the late 7th century BCE, was the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which itself was conquered by the Persian king Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE. The Neo-Babylonians, despite their role in Assyria's destruction, nonetheless continued many Assyrian traditions. For example, particularly under King Nebuchadnezzar, the Neo-Babylonians were active in importing exotic animals like lions, just like their Assyrian predecessors. We even hear of a royal monkey keeper in contemporary sources. Nebuchadnezzar, however, is perhaps best known for the massive garden complex which he allegedly built in Babylon, the so-called Hanging Gardens of Babylon. According to later Greek sources, the inspiration for this garden complex was Nebuchadnezzar's Median wife, who longed for the landscapes of her homeland. In response, the king is said to have built a magnificent terrace garden replete with plants and trees native to Medea. According to some scholars, the design of this complex may harken back to the terrace garden built by Sennacherib in Assyria. Be that as it may, there are many problems in the interpretation of the Hanging Gardens. First and foremost is the fact we have no firm evidence that such a structure was ever built, at least on the scale suggested by Greek sources. No explicit archaeological evidence has been found of the Hanging Gardens in Babylon, and no Babylonian texts specifically mention the Hanging Gardens either. Only later Greek writers suggest the supposed splendors of this complex. Many scholars, not wishing to accuse the Greeks of outright fabrication, have suggested that Nebuchadnezzar did build some sort of royal garden at Babylon, which would, of course, be entirely in line with earlier Near Eastern tradition. The extent and scale of this garden, however, would have been considerably less than that suggested by later Greek writers. Perhaps the Greeks who saw such a garden would have been overly impressed and subject to exaggeration to the lack of such royal gardens in contemporary Greece. And here's a relatively recent interpretation of if there was indeed a quote-unquote Hanging Gardens of Babylon, what it may have looked like in reality. So the idea here is that basically a garden complex was built between the palace complex and the bend of the Euphrates. So it's still a very nice garden, but not quite what the Greek sources suggest. Much firmer evidence, fortunately, survives concerning Persian animal parks and gardens, which, as we have seen, were often lumped together under the name paradisoi by the Greeks who encountered them. Although the Persians certainly followed Assyrian precedent in many respects, The design of such structures reached a new level of sophistication under the Persians. A good example of this sophistication in design is seen in the palace complex at Pasargadae, built in the mid-6th century BCE by the founder of the Persian Empire, Cyrus the Great. Stone channels, fed by pre-existing irrigation channels, not only provided water for the various plants in the garden, but also served to divide it up into different sections. Royal pavilions were also placed in axial alignment within the garden. It is this integration of garden and palace buildings into a single complex, rather than the garden merely being an annex to a pre-existing palace, which is the unique feature of Cyrus's design, a design which proved influential upon later garden complexes in the Near and Middle East. The inclusiveness of this garden complex's design is perhaps reflected by the variety of tasks which could be performed within it. First and foremost, of course, was the garden's purpose as a place of leisure for the king and his retinue. The complex, however, could also be used for a variety of official functions. Apart from religious rituals, Cyrus's garden complex could also be used for royal audiences. The thrones situated within the royal pavilions meant that the king could receive dignitaries or emissaries surrounded by the gardens, signifying the abundance of his realm. Therefore, the royal garden under Cyrus and his successors could, at least on occasion, become something of an administrative center, in addition to its other functions. Paradisoi, of both the plant and animal variety, subsequently spread throughout Persian territory. Every satrapal or provincial capital within the Persian Empire is thought to have possessed at least one such facility, which mirrored somewhat the larger Paradisoi to be found in the heart of the empire. Just as in the Assyrian Empire, many of these enclosures continue to be used for at least partly utilitarian purposes. For example, the book of Nehemiah in the Bible records that the Persian king Artaxerxes possessed a tree enclosure, which provided timber for building as well as other purposes. Certain differences, however, appear to have existed between the Assyrian and Persian paradisoi. In general, the Persians appear to have been more interested in botanical rather than animal enclosures. Part of the reason for this floral emphasis, so to speak, perhaps lay in the fact that in terms of Persian royal ideology, one of the most important duties of the king was to ensure the agricultural prosperity of his subjects. The provision of horticultural preserves throughout Persian territory would, of course, symbolize the king's solicitude in this regard. This is not to say that Persian kings, as well as members of the Persian nobility, were not interested in hunting. Just as in Assyrian culture, success in hunting such animals as lions, whether real or alleged, was one of the ways in which the Persian king could demonstrate his worthiness to rule. It appears, however, that the Persian elite much preferred to hunt in the wild rather than within the confines of an animal enclosure. Many of the Persian paradisoi in which hunts are said to have occurred appear to have been relatively modest in size, and the Persians do not appear to have attached nearly as much ritual significance to the hunts within these enclosures as did the earlier Assyrians. As we shall see, it is the Macedonians and Greeks during the course of Alexander the Great's campaigns who appear to have been particularly taken with the hunting possibilities to be found within Persian paradisoi. The Persian paradisoi, as well as their associated ideology, made a profound impact upon Greek culture, beginning in the classical period. It is being suggested, for example, that the Athenian leader Cimon was influenced by contemporary Persian parks and gardens when, in the early 5th century BCE, he refurbished the Academy Grove in Athens into a form of city park, replete with the provision of fresh water and shaded walkways. So this is the Academy up here, basically northwest of the main city. Some of you may be familiar with this location because, of course, this is later the location of the philosophical school established by Plato. And of course, this is why we still use the term academy for a place of learning today. Our first major Greek written source on the Persian Paradisoi, and the first to actually use the term, is Xenophon, who had traveled and fought more widely in Persian territory than the vast majority of his Greek contemporaries. Throughout his relevant writings, Xenophon portrays the Paradisoi as being an integral aspect of Persian culture and claims that the hunting of wild animals in such facilities was an important aspect of a Persian aristocrat's upbringing. Most of the Paradisoi described in detail by Xenophon, however, are of the botanical rather than the animal variety. It is being suggested, in fact, that the emphasis of Greek writers like Xenophon upon the latter type of enclosure may have more to do with the popularity of hunting within Greek culture as opposed to the actual number of animal Paradisoi within Persian territory. Despite Xenophon's apparent overemphasis upon animal as opposed to plant Paradisoi, however, he does provide us with useful information on the latter. According to his descriptions, what often characterized Persian botanical gardens was the number and variety of trees, as well as the orderly arrangement of plants and walkways within the enclosure. The provision of fresh water, of course, be it from a natural or artificial source, was also a necessary feature. Certainly, Xenophon appears to have been at least partly influenced by contemporary Persian Paradisoi when he later set up his own preserve on his state in the Peloponnese. The preserve included such typical Persian amenities as fruit trees and a fish-stocked river. It also, however, included abundant game, an addition likely due to Xenophon's own preference. The Persians do not appear to have generally combined their animal and plant enclosures in the manner carried out by Xenophon. In his work entitled The Oikonomicus, Xenophon also stresses a link between Persian royal ideology and agriculture, and I quote, "He, the king, examines all the land that he sees as he rides through it, and by sending men whom he trusts, he surveys the land he does not examine personally. And those governors whom he observes presenting densely populated land and fields under cultivation stocked with trees and crops that grow in that region, to these he gives additional territory, and he lavishes gifts on them and rewards them with seats of honor. But those whose land he sees uncultivated and sparsely populated because of the governor's lack of concern, he punishes, removing them from office and appointing other governors." According to Xenophon's account, Persian royalty would themselves periodically labor in their Paradisoi, something which was amazing to a Greek audience. The Persian Paradisoi and their associated ideology had an even more profound effect upon the Greek world during the Hellenistic period, beginning with the campaigns of Alexander. Just as in Persia, hunting was an esteemed activity amongst the Macedonian elite. In fact, according to time-honored custom, a Macedonian male did not have the right to recline at a symposium or banquet until he had killed a boar single-handedly without a net, thereby proving his worth to his peers. It is no surprise then that Alexander and his Macedonian troops, in the course of their march through Persian territory, took advantage of the hunting opportunities provided by local paradisoi. For example, according to the historian Quintus Curtius, writing in the 1st century CE, Alexander and his men slew 4,000 beasts in just one Persian enclosure. Interestingly, Curtius claims that the enclosure in question had been left untouched by the Persians for 4 generations prior to the arrival of the Macedonian army, which, if his information is correct, suggests that the Persians were perhaps using this enclosure for breeding animals rather than killing them. A number of modern scholars, however, have argued that Curtius's description of the Persian paradisoi and the allegedly large number of animals they contained is anachronistic, based more upon the animal enclosures set up in Macedonia after Alexander's campaigns and the Roman animal spectacles of his own day, rather than the actual appearance of Persian enclosures in the 4th century BCE. Be that as it may, by the time of Rome's defeat of Macedonia in the 2nd century BCE, a number of large preserves had been set up in the kingdom for the breeding of game, which do not appear to have existed prior to Alexander's invasion of Persia some 2 centuries earlier. Alexander also made use of royal Persian hunting ideology in the course of his campaigns. After the death of Darius III, Alexander claimed to be the legitimate king of Persia. In order to help substantiate this claim, Alexander, or his propaganda, emphasized his prowess in killing lions, a supposed proof of royal legitimacy, which, as we have seen, had already been long established in the Near East. As a result of this claim, the histories of Alexander are filled with anecdotes illustrating his alleged courage and prowess in killing lions and other ferocious animals during his campaign in Persia. Such propaganda is also reflected in artwork created during or shortly after Alexander's lifetime, such as the well-known lion hunt mosaic from the Macedonian city of Epplett. In the aftermath of Alexander's unexpected death in 323 BCE, his generals, the so-called Diadokoi, were not slow to make their own use of Persian royal ideology in their scramble for power. First of all, it is presumably no coincidence that one of the first major conferences held between the generals to decide upon the division of Alexander's empire was held at Paradisos, or Triple Paradise, a large Persian preserve somewhere in Syria. As we have seen, Persian kings like Cyrus the Great could conduct state business in royal parks and gardens, so it is not surprising that the Diadokoi chose just such a venue for their own pretensions as well. Subsequently, the Diadokoi, who had no hereditary claim to rule, based their claims, in part at least, on the same hunting ideology which Alexander had used to support his claim to the kingship of Persia. As a result, just as in the case of Alexander himself, stories were circulated concerning the alleged hunting prowess of the Diadokoi. Lysimachus, for example, was said to have single-handedly slain a lion of enormous size while serving under Alexander. Such propaganda, naturally enough, also extended to the visual sphere. The right-hand figure on the Pella mosaic is thought by many scholars to be Craterus, another of Alexander's former generals who wished to advance his own cause by associating his own alleged hunting prowess with that of Alexander. Interestingly, this literary and artistic emphasis on hunting prowess only lasted for approximately a generation after Alexander. Subsequent Hellenistic rulers could base their claims to rule upon descent from the original Diadochoi, and therefore had no need to advertise their alleged hunting prowess. Not surprisingly, parks and gardens, at least in part inspired by their Near Eastern antecedents, were a feature of the Hellenistic kingdoms which emerged out of the breakup of Alexander's empire. In the Seleucid Empire, the green one here, which incorporated much of the former Persian territory, a number of originally Persian paradisoi continued to be maintained under their new masters. In addition, a number of new parks and gardens were set up throughout Seleucid territory, from Ai-Khanoum in the east to Antioch in the west. The palace complex of Ai-Khanoum, whose original name is not known for certain, originally built by a Seleucid governor in the early 3rd century BCE, appears to have included some sort of paradisos extending from the west side of the palace building down to the Oxus River. This supposition is supported not only by the existence of a natural water source, the Oxus River, but the remains of what appears to have been an enormous swimming pool in the area as well. There's also been some suggestion that this unidentified building to the south of the actual palace complex may actually have been part of the Paradisos or enclosure as well. The royal palace and surrounding park in Antioch are thought to have been established by Antiochus I, the second ruler in the Seleucid dynasty. Antiochus was of Persian descent on his mother's side and had spent most of his life prior to becoming king in the east. So it is not surprising that he might wish to incorporate a Persian-style paradisos in the new western capital of the Seleucid Empire. So yeah, basically, like many of the other examples I've already shown you, it is presumed that there was some sort of paradisos on the royal island here attached to the Seleucid royal palace. In addition to the complex within Antioch itself, the nearby sanctuary and resort of Daphne also included parkland which could accommodate literally thousands of royal guests at any one time. For example, there are recorded Seleucid ceremonies at Daphne in the 2nd century BCE, which are said to have included as many as 9,000 guests. So obviously, you would need a fairly complex paradisos arrangement, if I can term it that, to accommodate so many visitors. In Hellenistic Egypt, royal parks and gardens were not only inspired by the Persian paradisoi, which Ptolemy, the founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty, had encountered as a general in Alexander's army, but also by native Egyptian traditions. Ptolemy is known to have stayed at a number of pre-existing pharaonic palaces during the early part of his reign in Egypt, including the aforementioned palace of Apries. And it appears that these palaces and their grounds inspired Ptolemaic architecture as much as Persian precedents. The most elaborate Egyptian parks and gardens during the Ptolemaic period were found, of course, in the royal capital of Alexandria. Like other royal gardens we have already examined, those in Alexandria were located in close proximity to the royal palace. roughly where the red dot is there. One unique feature of this precinct, however, was the Museon, or research institute established by the Ptolemies, as well as the botanical and zoological gardens established within the royal garden complex. The Ptolemies, like earlier rulers in the Near East, were active in the importation and propagation of various types of plants and animals, in part to support the research of scholars in the Museon. This research element is yet another function added to those of the Paradisoi we have already mentioned. The royal precinct in Alexandria would help ensure that the term Paradisos, or its cognates at least, would survive in common parlance up to the present day. When Greek Jews in Alexandria sought to translate the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek, most likely in the 3rd century BCE, one of the terms they had to translate, of course, was Garden of Eden. Needless to say, the concept of the Garden of Eden, with its proliferation of both plant and animal life, had no doubt been influenced by Near Eastern parks and gardens long before this date. The term chosen by Greek translators for Garden of Eden was Paradisos tes Trouphes, or Garden of Extravagance / luxuriousness. Trouphe can mean extravagance or luxuriousness. The luxuriant garden, which they had in mind as a parallel for the Garden of Eden, of course, was the royal precinct of Alexandria. When subsequent Jewish and Christian theologians claimed that the righteous would return to the Garden of Eden in the afterlife, the term Paradisos, or its cognates, continued to be used in reference to it. As a result, in modern parlance, the connotation of a paradise as a place of heavenly blessings has overshadowed its original, somewhat more mundane meaning. It remains only to discuss briefly the influence of Paradisoi upon the ancient Romans. The Romans, in the course of their expansion in the later Republic, annexed many of the Hellenistic kingdoms and thereby became familiar with Hellenistic architecture, including the magnificent Paradisoi of such cities as Alexandria. Such parks and gardens had a pronounced influence upon subsequent Roman architecture. The general design of many late Republican villas, for example, with planned parks or gardens adjacent to the residence, is certainly reminiscent of Hellenistic and earlier designs. In the same period, many Roman aristocrats also collected various animals on their estates, likely an emulation of Hellenistic and earlier faunal collections in the East. Such influence is also seen in imperial architecture, most notably the Domus Aurea, or Golden House of Nero, with its residence surrounded by parkland, stocked with a wide variety of animals. Nero's palace bore a distinct similarity to the royal precinct in Ptolemaic Alexandria. The populace of Rome, however, was ultimately less tolerant of such ostentation in their midst than their counterparts in Alexandria. And as many of you may already know, after Caesar or Nero offs himself, well, actually he has someone help him off himself. In the Roman perception, Nero was so useless that he couldn't even off himself by himself. Anyhow, after Nero is no longer in the picture, what subsequently happens is that the later Emperor Vespasian, in a great popularity move, he basically fills in this artificial lake, opens up the immense space of the Domus Aurea to the Roman public once more, and he basically builds the Colosseum where the lake can be. Again, which is a great propaganda move, because previously this area had only been for the pleasure of Nero and his retinue. But now Vespasian had not only opened up this whole area for the Roman populace, he built a great new arena where the Romans could go see gladiators and so forth. So again, that's what I mean when I say the Romans were generally a little less tolerant of this sort of thing than their Ptolemaic counterparts. The final topic to be addressed, and one which, as mentioned, initially inspired my research into Near Eastern Paradisoi and their associated ideology, is the possible influence of Near Eastern precedents upon Roman venationes, the popular combats of wild animals staged in such arenas as the Colosseum. Certainly, some of the same general ideology underpinned both the royal lion hunts of the Assyrians and the venationes of the Roman Empire. In both cases, the rulers in question exhibited their power, more particularly their mastery over nature, by having various animals collected and killed under their auspices. In my opinion, however, this is where the similarities between the two types of phenomena largely end. While Near Eastern rulers would occasionally exhibit their hunting skills to relatively small groups of spectators, Roman venationes were witnessed by literally tens of thousands of spectators at any given time. The Colosseum, for example, held approximately 50,000 spectators. It's not too far off a modern football stadium. In addition, while Near Eastern kings would personally kill animals as a sign of their prowess, Roman emperors, apart from acknowledged maniacs like Commodus, would leave the actual fighting to specially trained performers in the arena. Therefore, although both events necessitated the collection of animals, which had already begun in the Republican period due to Hellenistic influence, the mechanics of each were otherwise quite different. As I have argued elsewhere, the venationes owed, I should say, much more of their inspiration to Roman gladiatorial combats than Near Eastern antecedents. Nevertheless, the foregoing discussion has hopefully illustrated the substantial influence of Paradisoi, not only among the states of the ancient Near East, but also within the classical world. It has not been possible, of course, to examine all the parks and gardens of antiquity, but the longevity of the Paradisos as an institution is nonetheless clear. Such facilities were not merely places of recreation, but were also an embodiment of royal authority and prestige. No doubt one of the principal reasons why the Paradisos, as both a term and institution, ultimately lasted well beyond antiquity. Such a topic, however, is beyond the scope of our present discussion. Thank you.